Thank you, everyone. Let's go ahead and just jump right into this. Here to talk about Microsoft Teams Power Virtual Agents. And going to be using Slido. I will pull that up actually here again in a bit as far as that code. But first, let me do a really quick introduction to myself. So again, my name is Matt Jimison. I, a long time ago, got my Bachelor of Science in Computer Graphics Technology. I always like to point that out because I think starting on the front end of the user experience helps, me understand that that's how users see our applications. They don't necessarily see the code or the technology behind them. They see the experience that we create. And even though that's the only time I spent really in graphics design and I've been doing development ever since, I think that's it's an important part of my journey. 19 plus years of IT experience, started out as a developer, worked as an architect. I actually spent 12 years at a consulting company and worked up the ranks there up to managing director running their Microsoft consultancy. But about a year ago at this time, actually a year ago tomorrow, I made the decision that I missed coding. I missed developing. I wanted to get back into that. And so I made the decision to join the team over at Takeda Pharmaceuticals as the head of their intelligent solutions group. The goal was to help them start a Power Virtual Agents practice. And they had Power Virtual Agents and they wanted to essentially utilize more there. And so that's what I was brought on to do. I've been loving it ever since. Mentioned that a lot of different programming languages, so from new to old. And I got started with SharePoint back in 2008. I was a .NET developer, and a company was looking for someone that was a .NET dev that was willing to learn all about the SharePoint experience. And so developing WSPs, event receivers, feature receivers, web parts, all of that stuff. That's where I grew up in SharePoint. Never got to use SharePoint 2003, so I do know several people that have. So that was my first version. But I was fortunate enough actually in July to become a Microsoft MVP in the business application space. Like I said, I've been working really every day just on developing solutions within the Power Platform and heavily in Power Virtual Agents, and as a result of that, Power Automate. So I want to switch over now really quickly, and I want to do a live poll. I want to make sure that this is interactive, and I really want to understand, where everyone is at, as far as their experience goes with Power Virtual Agents. So that is the Slido information. So I know that we don't have a super large group, and by all means, if anybody wants to unmute and sort of chime in, let's do that. I want to keep this really informal. But I've got a few questions that I just wanted to get a gauge of where we're all at before I get into the presentation. Will help me spend more or less time in certain areas as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and go to the first question. And actually, that is not the first question. There we go. There's the first question. So how much experience do you have with Power Virtual Agents? So I'm just curious to see that, what I've seen so far in a lot of conversations, I think Power Virtual Agents feels still like one of the least tapped areas of the Power Platform. And, even 18 months ago, I would say if I had been taking this poll, I would have said very little experience with it. It's definitely something, though, that I think with generative AI, has definitely sort of become even more popular. I think with generative AI, the idea of chatbots being the vehicle for creating those types of experiences, things like ChatGPT, I think that's made it, even more popular. And so I think, this is good. But so it looks like we've got the vast majority with either little or no experience, at least one or two people that have a ton of experience and a few that know a little bit. So that's actually a good mix and sort of what I would expect. Okay, so now let's actually go to the next question. So when you think about Power Virtual Agents and not knowing everyone's background here, whether you're a consultant working with a variety of customers or you're working at a particular employer, just curious to see if you haven't, and again, it feels like there's a fair amount of folks that have not utilized it. What do you think the reason for that is, as far as why you haven't seen Power Virtual Agents? Okay, so so two people have responded here so far. Okay, so too expensive, too difficult. We don't have a need. Go ahead and just give it a few more seconds here. I think the too expensive part is interesting because that's definitely something that I've heard about. And part of, the reason we're here today is to talk about Power Virtual Agents for Microsoft Teams. which is not going to necessarily come, it's not going to come at an additional expense provided you have E3 licenses. We'll get into all of that, but this hopefully will, if you're in that camp, right, of it's just too expensive to utilize, then hopefully you'll sort of see, well, what could I do with my existing licensing without having to necessarily incur some additional costs? So that is that. Thank you for that. And then we just have one more question. Okay. This is general, but I think when it comes to the Power Platform, I think we've all seen the need potentially, depending on what you're trying to do, to have to go with premium level type licenses. So just asking at a really high level, when you think about Microsoft 365 licenses, where you are, where your customers are at, what does it look like? Is it great? And essentially whatever anyone needs, they get. Spare no expense, Jurassic Park style. We'll buy it and we'll get everyone set up. Is it adequate? Okay, so far that's adequate. We will do it for certain people, but most people are going to basically stick with the E3. And no, so far no one is saying limited. That's good. So it looks like we've got 5 to 7 each time on this poll. So okay, so adequate, great. Okay, that's pretty good. All right, awesome. So it's just helpful to understand that too, because I think when you look at the opportunity to bring in something, there are certain organizations that are going to say, well, look, this is what we have, this is what we're sticking with, versus, hey, if there's a use case, then we're not afraid to look into it and to purchase premium licensing, etc. Awesome. Thank you again, and we're going to go ahead and jump into the presentation now. Okay. So we're going to talk, to start out here, just chatbots in general. We're going to go pretty quickly on this. This is a quote. This is from me, but I like to say, I think it's important that chatbots are often a great in addition to option as opposed to an instead of option. And what I mean by that is I've seen in the past where people are ready to just go all in on chatbots. They feel like, let's rewrite this application, let's rewrite that application. And sometimes it feels like the chatbot doesn't have to replace something necessarily, right? It could assist. I look at it as a different channel, right? When we think about all the different ways that we can communicate. And so the thing that I like to start out with these types of conversations is it doesn't have to be the thing. A chatbot a lot of times can be the assistant that's helpful. You think about even going to get support, and you have the ability to call someone, you have the ability to email someone, you have the ability to chat with someone. It's fill out a form online, try to find your own answer. There's different ways to go about it, but it doesn't have to be the only way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here with sort of use cases, good use cases, right? Low complexity tasks, minimal user input. And I like to think about chatbots is it's going to be likely, not always the case, but likely that the individual is actually going to be on a mobile device potentially. So you're not going to want to have them have to fill out, do a lot of typing, et cetera, necessarily. That's not going to be a great experience for them. So you're looking at something that's fairly low complexity, constant online customer support. The great thing about chatbots, right? They don't ever go to sleep. They don't ever need to take time off. So being able to put something out there, and self-service capabilities is an awesome use case where, again, you can drive traffic away from members on your team, right, who are overburdened and overworked and are doing other things. You can try to take some of that burden and put it on a chatbot by creating ways to do self-service and things of that nature. And then the last one, which I'm extremely interested in, we're not going to get into generative AI today. We'll talk about why we're not going to, largely because of limitations. But I'm working a lot with the generative AI space with Azure OpenAI and PVA Premium bots. In the modern search interface, this idea that we can just get the answer directly, instead of having to sort through pages and pages of results from Google and trying to find out which is the right one. Instead, we can ask a question, how do I do this? And I get the answer. I don't even have to go through the pages. So chatbots, when they have the right information and they have the right configuration set up, that's going to be a great experience to be able to go find things. I would pause on them when the business readiness really lacks. Either the business isn't sure what they want to build, the business isn't sure what they can support, and a good use case on this actually dives into the next one on, things that require complex user input, is, had something a couple of years ago where a customer was looking to build something that they said, hey, we need a chatbot. And as we got into the conversation and started talking about, okay, well, what's this going to do? Well, it was a reservation system. There were a lot of different fields to fill out, additional logic, validation. And it got to a point where somebody said, wait, does it make sense to have this as a chatbot? Is that actually going to be a great experience? Or would this be better as a power app, right? Having something more visual. And so again, if you're not really sure exactly what you're looking to do, don't just jump into chatbots. Don't just jump into anything, honestly, right? That's sort of consulting 101 is find out the why. Why are you looking to build something, and making sure you understand the use case before you pick the technology. The other thing I would say is sensitive topics, and this is an interesting one, again, with generative AI, but the idea that if it's something very personal that someone, needs to, you want to make sure you're handling it delicately. You don't want to necessarily look at a chatbot. A horrible example of this would be, think about a Lex, the layoff chatbot, right? That, messages everyone that was laid off and, the next round of layoffs, and, tells them why they were laid off and when their last day is. Not the kind of thing I think anyone wants to get from a chatbot. Although sadly with, mass layoffs, I think, those experiences unfortunately aren't great from what I hear. But again, something like that, right? Feels more like a one-on-one type conversation. So that is that on the use cases. And then lastly, I want to get into something. I want to be really direct and transparent with you all. We're at a weird time with PVA for Teams. And what I mean by that is we have PVA for Teams. It's included in your E3 licensing, right? I mentioned that before. You access it directly from Teams. We're going to play with it a lot today. You had over 6 months ago PVA Premium. I'm going to call it version 1. Microsoft likes to call the new one Premium 2, so 1 versus 2. That was the legacy canvas. In essence, it basically was the PVA for Teams canvas. It had more things it could do with bot framework, composer, etc. And now we can, although we can still work with bots we built in it, we can't even build anything brand new in it because we have this truly much better new quote unquote unified canvas that came out around June. And it's sort of combined the PVA experience with the bot framework composer experience, that advanced functionality like adaptive cards, really cool things that took quite a bit more work previously are a lot easier to do, and it's super cool and awesome. But what's happened now is this PVA for Teams hasn't gotten that update. That's a question that I've asked Microsoft multiple times. I've not gotten a clear answer. I think it's likely that the unified canvas in some way, shape, or form would come to PVA for Teams. But again, if you sort of think through even the process of Premium 1 to Premium 2, I think the goal will be over time, right, to not have a need for Premium 1. The same thing if they update PVA for Teams, will, what's the timeline look like for getting all of those bots out of there? So I'm by no means saying don't use it, but I would say don't get too comfortable, because in the next 6 to 18 months, is it possible that that UI updates? Yeah. And is it drastically different? No, you're going to like it better. I promise you. If going to the unified canvas, you're going to like it better. Depending on how time goes today, we'll look at a few potential comparisons on how things look. It is still very, very similar, but it's something just to keep in mind, because again, it's sort of in a unique state, and that it hasn't gotten the latest and greatest, and now it's got the UI that you can't even use in the web version. So I just wanted to point that out. All right, we're going to go through quickly on some of these slides, because again, the goal for today would be the majority of time that we can spend building, and then have time for questions as well. Okay, so from a cost perspective, obviously the great thing is going to be that it's included under E3 licenses. PVA for Teams is, so if what we need to do can be done with it, it's not going to cost anything additional, which is great. One thing that I want to call out though on Premium, it's really, really interesting, and get a lot of customers that will do this. They'll go in, they'll say, oh, I had to start a trial, started the trial, I need to extend the trial. The developer license for PVA Premium that you need in order to be able to develop premium bots in the web UI is actually a $0 cost, interestingly enough. What you're paying for on PVA are the number of sessions that you expect each month. You're not actually paying for the developers, but if you don't get those free licenses and have them assigned, everyone's going to be triggering sort of that trial. So it's one thing to keep in mind if you ever do go premium, that it's not really about licensing the developers, but understanding that by licensing a developer, you're giving them the ability to utilize the premium sessions that you've purchased. So something that's a little bit interesting compared to a lot of other Microsoft licensing. From a channel perspective, well, it's easy because it's going to be Teams only. And if you need anything that's not in Teams, it's not going to be for you, period, end of story. Premium obviously can do a ton of different channels though. From an integration standpoint, it's going to be more limited. We're going to be talking about standard connections. We're not going to be talking about things like Azure SQL Server, et cetera, custom connectors. That's not where PVA for Teams is going to shine because, again, it's included in your E3. There's going to be things that are left out, right? That would be reason for you to potentially look at the premium usage, which ties back sort of the conversation we started at the beginning, which, how liable is your organization to go for that? I love the security on PVA for Teams. I wish that they had PVA for SharePoint in a similar fashion and that it's all handled for you. You don't have to do anything. It is one of 3 different security options. Once you set it up that way, it's going to require people are signed into Teams. It's going to know who they are, which is awesome. Allows us to do a lot of really cool things and Power Automate, and you don't have to worry about it. If you want to do premium, you can have anonymous bots. You can have bots that are on websites, et cetera, but you're going to have additional configuration to configure single sign-on, et cetera. And one important thing to understand is if you do PVA for Teams and you're saying, well, how do I give someone the ability to co-author the bot with me? The people that have the ability to edit the bot are the owners of the team the bot is associated to. And that is it, period, the end. You can't change that. So when you think about who's going to be responsible for managing it, if for some reason you've got somebody that you need to manage it that's not an owner of a team, you might think about a new team. Just because you have a team associated with a bot doesn't mean it can't be deployed to other teams. But that is one thing that you have to sort of get used to is that you don't have the ability to just pull in someone individually. It's just going to be the owners that's going to parrot that. You also can't even share it with an individual. You have to share it at the security group level. Skills, we won't really go into here. That's something a little bit more advanced, reusable. Dialogues, you're not going to get adaptive cards. Maybe we would get adaptive cards if and when we actually get the unified canvas, but for right now, that is just not an option, period. Live agent stuff, not an option either. Key terms here, this is where we're actually going to be spending our time in the demo. I put this here not so that I would go over each of these terms with you, but so that afterwards you have a chance to download the deck. I think this is just a great place to familiarize yourself again if you haven't done anything with PVA yet, to sort of understand what are the core concepts. So again, this is more for after, not right now, but we are going to hit all of these different things. And so for that, we are going to jump into our first demo where we're going to actually take a live look at PVA for Teams. 1 second. Okay. So PVA for Teams, again, we mentioned is something you have to access directly in Microsoft Teams. If you don't have it, you can actually go to the App Store. You can look for that. You can look for Power Virtual Agents. And I actually already have it installed. So I'm going to see the option to open there. But this is a quick tip, but this is something that I always tell people that I think is once you've started developing, it's easy to appreciate. Rather than actually launching the app by clicking on this, and I've actually pinned it, right? So I can see I could unpin it, but I've pinned it. Rather than clicking on this, what's going to happen if you click on it is you're going to load PVA for Teams in the context of the window. And then you can see right now there's a chat bubble there, right, for this particular meeting. And if I go over to that chat, then all of a sudden I'm losing the context of the bot. So what I always tell folks to do is right click on that and say pop out app. It's just going to save you a lot of trouble because then if you need to go back, it's a separate window for your conversations, for any collaboration that you're trying to do. You won't accidentally walk away from your bot without realizing it. So small thing, but definitely important and something that works well with other apps, to be honest, within Microsoft Teams too. Okay, so a PVA bot has to be tied to a particular team. And so when you look at this, when you get started here, I'm going to jump over to chatbots. And I have one that's already been started, but we'll create a new bot. And so we're going to go down here and say to create chatbot. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to require that I actually associate that to a team. I've only got one here on my tenant, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And these are things depending on whether you've created one or not. And I have created one before, so this shouldn't be as bad. But if you haven't before, this potentially could trigger Dataverse for Teams being created behind the scenes. So the first time, it's going to take a little bit longer. Just talking about just a few minutes here, nothing major, but something to keep in mind. So we're going to go actually call this the Chatterbot Inc. bot. Now the language is we're going to have different options, but it's going to be one language and one language only. This isn't anything any differently, unfortunately. In PVA Premium, every bot for right now just speaks one language. And so things you can do with translation, things like Azure OpenAI that do a pretty good job with it. But when you're talking about mapping triggers and everything else that we're going to look at in a second, just something to keep in mind. Now, that is a feature like a multilingual bot, right, with localization, is something that should be coming and is definitely on the roadmap. But right now, we're just talking about one. So we're going to go ahead and click create. And this is going to take just a minute or so. And again, even all of these setups on the bots, and even within the last 3 months, Microsoft has worked, especially on the newer side for sure, on creating them quicker. And so it's not anything that takes too long. And again, for this particular right here, we're pretty good. And I think that's even a new graphic there, so that's fun that the robot is in a hamster wheel. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at the left-hand side before we go too far. And actually, what I'm going to do here too is let's go ahead and just zoom in a little bit more. Okay. So the overview is just where we're getting started with the bot, but we were going to have our topics list. So our topics essentially are the different things that we want to do with our bot. And each topic potentially can have what are called trigger phrases, which is what the bot is listening for the user to type for it to be able to connect things together. So that's really important. We're going to take a look at that, doing various tests here in a second. But this is where you are going to spend the majority of your time is in topics. Entities, there are a ton of out-of-the-box entities that are available here, and this is the ability for the bot to essentially parse content out and sort of normalize it, right? So if we're looking for a city name, if we're looking for a color, a continent, an email address, right? We can use these and we can select them when we ask questions from the user to say, we want to make sure we're getting one of these, and even to the point where if the bot's not getting it, that can reprompt the user and say, this is what we're looking for. Analytics is something that we're not going to have anything on because it's a brand new bot, but if you want to start to see analytics, the number of sessions you're using, customer satisfaction, if anyone uses that, at the end, you're going to be able to see this over time. Publishing is the act of actually making this bot and whatever changes you've recently done available to everyone. So by default, just because we've got a bot out here, after we've published it, we're making some more changes, working together on it. Think of that as like a draft document, right? Where only the owners of the site are going to be able to see those changes, which is good. So when you're ready to publish it for everyone to see, then you would go to publish. Settings are going to be a little bit more limited than this really looks. The details is going to be helpful as far as giving the bot a name, changing that icon if we wanted to, etc. But channels, which again, this is coming from just the overall PVA UI, is only going to be Microsoft Teams because that's the way the authentication is set up. And so there's not anything that we're going to be able to change here. And this hide bot down here and test your bot, that is just the ability to essentially bring up the bot. Now, what's nice about that is, so we'll jump back over to topics and we'll go ahead and create a new topic. And we'll go ahead and say from blank. And this is where we're going to add our trigger phrases. So we're going to pretend Chatterbots is this company that has multiple locations in the US. And this is like an assistant bot to help you. So we're going to say, like, where's a good place to get lunch? And we'll maybe say, where do people go for lunch? We could say, what should I eat for lunch? Okay, and just give it a few different flavors of that so that we can trigger this. So now we've got our trigger phrases and we have by default a message. So these are the additional nodes, right? So again, this is the trigger phrases are absolutely critical. If you don't write good trigger phrases, and you'll be able to test it to be able to see where you're getting hits and not, but if you don't trigger what the user is looking for, they're not going to get here. They're not going to get that experience. So I'd say, writing good trigger phrases, being thorough with that is very, very important. So for the message here, initially, we're just going to say, sounds like you're looking for lunch. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'll give this a name. And to do that, I'm going to click on details here and say lunch. And then I'm going to click save. Okay, so now I'm going to say test the bot. And I'm just going to say, what's good for lunch? Now, what's really cool is that in this experience, not only were we able to just right away start testing it, but we're actually seeing things light up over here. So we know that, okay, this got triggered based on what was entered, and then we're seeing this as the message. So it sounds like you're looking for lunch. Okay. So that's sort of super, super basic, but let's go ahead and get rid of this message. And let's say that we were going to ask a question. We would say, which location are you at? Again, this is the idea that we have these different locations. So we're going to say Indianapolis is one. We're going to say Kansas City is one. And we're going to say Boston is one. Okay, and then we have a variable coming out of that. So whatever they choose, go ahead and click on this, and we can say city. Okay, and then the next thing that we're seeing here, what's happening automatically is a condition. So we're going to do different things based on a condition. So it's smart enough right now to say for each of these different options, I'm going to give you a different path, right? So we can see, okay, if it was Indianapolis, now I can do these things. If it was Kansas City, I can do these things, etc., and so forth. Now, the reality is that we might want to, let's say we can add one here and say show a message, and we'll say it looks like you're in, and then over here we're going to do insert variable. We're actually going to mention that city name. And so right now what would happen is if I chose Kansas City, it would say looks like you're in Kansas City. But let's say that I wanted all of these options to actually go there. And another option obviously would be to just not do the conditions at all, but just to show you, and this is one of the first things that changes a sort of, based on the newer UI. And that is if in PVA, in the newer PVA, if you want to sort of redirect back to another part, instead of being dragging this, you're going to actually just pick where you want it to go. But you can see that this dot I've clicked, so I clicked on the plus sign, right? And this is where I could ask another question. We're going to do a separate section here on flows here in a minute. I could show a message, go to a different topic, end it, right? But I want to just highlight this to where it turns purple. And this allows me to drag it and basically say that this is going to go here. Okay, so now what's happening is whether you're in Indianapolis or Kansas City, you're actually going to go here. And then if I wanted to do this Boston, same thing, I get that purple glow. And we're gonna go ahead and zoom out a little bit so we can make the connection. Okay, and now we actually have all three. So we'll go ahead and save that. We want to go ahead, it's gonna refresh automatically. Okay, so we can do it again. What's good for lunch? Okay, so now it's going to say, where are you? And we're in Indianapolis. Looks like you're in Indianapolis. Again, it was going to say that essentially no matter what. Okay, so the other thing that we can do that we'll jump into really quick, redirect to another topic, is we could say that we want to go ahead and we want to end the conversation. So that's going to be the satisfaction conversation. Did you get what you needed, et cetera? Would you like to fill out the customer satisfaction survey? Which, to be honest, I think, varies from person to person, but a lot of times if someone gets the information they need, they often will abandon the bot, which makes the whole analytics conversation interesting to me, because if you're focused solely on the number of people that abandon, it may not be that they abandoned because they didn't get what they needed. It might be they left because they indeed got what they needed. So it's something to keep in mind, just sort of when you look at those analytics. But that's the ability for us, if we wanted to be able to redirect. So if we go back in here, we save it one more time, it's going to refresh automatically. What's good for lunch? Okay, Indianapolis. Okay, and then looks like you're announced to answer your question. Yes. And this is where it's going to say, okay, right? So that's it. No, thanks. I don't need any more help. Okay. The other thing that, before we jump into sort of Power Automate capabilities, that's really cool, is this idea of slot filling. And what that is again, I mentioned the entities. That's one option that you can do this with, but the idea that the user's typing something, we get to the topic, and we're able to say, hey, wait a minute, they've already said this term, so based on that, I think that I actually know what the answer to this question is. So let's go back up here and look at this. So we said, okay, which location are you located at? If I click this, I have this option, this skip question. And so what I can say is skip it. When the user has already provided a response, just skip it, or I could say ask every time. When this is set, whether the user has already answered the question previously or we actually are able to detect an answer, we don't actually get asked the question. So let's actually refresh this really quick. Let's say, what's good for lunch in Indianapolis? What? Okay. So it says it looks like you're in Indianapolis, right? Again, it didn't actually ask us. We didn't tell it we were in Indianapolis. It was from the actual question. So, and then we're going to that. It's your question, yes or no. But that's sort of that slot filling idea that I'm able to ask something if I'm, and you can see obviously in the first one here, what's good for lunch is, which is not actually one of the things I put in. That's why what's a good place to get lunch. So that's why that didn't work, because I wasn't using the trigger phrases, which also brings up to, again, why that's critical. But you can see that I was able to add more than just the trigger phrase. And so somebody could say something like this. It's smart enough to go, oh, you've already told me where you are. And so now I'm going to go ahead and follow that pattern. So that is slot filling. Like I said, it's very, very key. It's not something that's necessarily just done on the triggering, but just it's really important. And the last thing that I will say about that is, let's go down here and let's see here. Let's go ahead and get rid of this one. And wanted to show this really quick on this identify. So this is where you're able to essentially say what you're looking for. If you just want to ask somebody to enter whatever they want, you would just say their retire response. If you want to go with the multiple choice options, you can do that, or you can go into these entities that we talked about, a Boolean yes or no, age, city, color, continent, etc. So you have the ability to do that, and where the bot is going to ensure. So I could say, what's your email address? Okay, so it's good for lunch, Indianapolis. What's your email address? So see, it's telling me it didn't understand because I didn't give it an email address. And then there it did. And so we haven't done anything afterwards, which is why it's not going anywhere. Okay. So Power Automate. Power Automate like is the engine behind Power Virtual Agents. So there's a lot that it does really well on its own, variables and things like that. But if you want to integrate with anything, external systems, Power Automate is the vehicle by which you do it. And so the reason I have a sandwich on here is I like to think of Power Automate and Power Virtual Agents sort of as that sandwich where the top bread is the inputs from Power Virtual Agents. And it's important to understand that the only type of variables Power Virtual Agents can send Power Automate are text variables, Boolean yes or no variables, or numbers. That is it. Then everything that you want to do essentially in Power Automate, you do, right? That's the magic. That's 99 seconds or less, because if it takes longer than that, Power Virtual Agents is going to time out waiting for Power Automate. That's another important thing to keep in mind. And when you start to do things in premium with generative AI, where it may take over a minute, you could get to a point where potentially PVA times out waiting, and you could look at other options for handling that. But right now, there's not a way to configure that. Hopefully, there will be in the future for things that we're doing. We shouldn't be too concerned with 99 seconds. I think at the point where if it's probably past 5 or 6 seconds, something's wrong. And then what we can send back is exactly the same thing. We can send back text, yes or no's or numbers. Now, I will say one change with PVA Premium, I could send back a text block that was formatted potentially like JSON, and I could parse it in PVA Premium and do lots of things like that. I can't do any of that with Power Virtual Agents for Teams. So that is something to keep in mind. You're just not going to have as much capability there. Okay, so now we're going to actually go and build a little bit of integration with these things. Okay, so I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this. I'm actually going to delete the condition. Like I said, we don't really need to have a different option if they're all going to be the same. So now we're just back to that. What's good for lunch? Where are you? Okay. So now what we're going to do is click on this, and let's go ahead and hide the bot too. So it gives us a little bit more room. And we're going to say that we want to call an action. This is going to give us the option to, if we had created flows already, which you can see clearly we haven't, we could add them, or we can go ahead and create a flow. And this is just telling me that I'm going to potentially lose save work. So let's actually save it because we've stripped all of those things off. And now we'll go ahead and do that again. So this is actually going to load the Power Automate UI again into Teams. So it's going to be the same UI you know and love, but it's going to be directly within Teams. So go ahead and give that a minute. And one of the things, the first thing that you're going to notice is that, again, we're going to have to sort of talk about what's going in and what's going out. And so for this particular use case, what we're trying to do is, and let's go ahead and pull this up too. We've got a SharePoint list. Let's see here. And let me go ahead and pull that up. We've got a SharePoint list right now with local lunch spots, and we've got our Indianapolis, Boston, Kansas City offices, and we've got different locations. And so we've got the name of the restaurant, and then we've got the address as an address field. So you can imagine a lot of different use cases like this, but where someone's looking for information on a certain location. So that's basically the use case here for that. Okay, and it looks like Power Automate is taking quite a while. Let's go ahead and close that. Let's actually try that one more time. Okay, there you go. Doesn't make any sense, but it just worked that time. Okay, so you've got these different templates. The key thing here is we're looking for something that starts with Power Automate. We just want a blank one. We don't want, if you had a particular need to send an email, you could start with one of these. These are just like any other Power Automate template. Find what works best for you. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to say lunch locations. Okay, and what we're going to say as our input is we're going to actually pass it that city. And what we're going to pass it back is the response. And we're going to talk about what that is here in just a second. So what we're going to do is and this is where, if you've done nothing with Power Virtual Agents, but you've done a lot with some Power Automate, you're going to feel right at home. Because again, outside of the triggers that are already set up there for you, this is going to be very much Power Automate. It's not specific necessarily to Power Virtual Agents, with the exception of how we format the content, which we'll talk about. So we're going to go ahead and say response. We've got this variable, and it is a string, and we're going to leave it at that. And now we're going to actually get SharePoint items. So we're going to pull that up. We're going to go ahead and wait for this to create a connection. And we want to go back to our Chatterbot site. We're going to go to our local lunch spots. We're going to click advanced options. And what we want to do is we want to look for them where the city was equal to what came in. And so, which is the city. Okay, so we're just looking for lunch spots where the city is equal to wherever they answered. Or again, if we picked it up based on what they typed in, we would get it that way as well. We're not going to order them by any certain way right now. We could do that if we wanted to. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to assume that we're getting multiple options. So we're going to do a for each loop here. And so apply to each, what we're going to apply from is the value. And then let's see here. The actual, so you could see again, this UI is a little bit abbreviated. This is actually, so I want to actually just get the, let's go ahead and actually save this really well. It's not going to like that. Oh, it did because we don't have a variable here, so we'll say response. Okay. And we will wait for this to save. Okay, I am actually going to try to just open this actually up and okay, and we are actually not going to see it here because it's the fact that it's in PVA, which is fine. Just refresh this to make sure. Let me see here really quick. 1 second. Okay, so what we are trying to do here is we're going to look through. Okay, we're trying to get back in here, and it is not liking me right now. Let's go ahead and try to go back here. Okay, now if we call an action, it may show up. Let's look at this one again. We may just redo it if it's still not letting us edit it. Okay, there we go. All right, much better. Okay. Now we're going to append. So we had that string variable. So we're going to append to the string variable. So that was response. And what we're going to say essentially is we're going to say the office. Actually, we don't need the office because we know where they are. We're going to say the title, and then we're going to say address and comma city, and then the state, and then space postal code. But we actually want to, in front of all of this, put a dash. Let's see here. And so when I mentioned that the way that we actually pass this back that's important is we're trying to do markdown format essentially. And so this dash space is going to help tell this that it's a list basically of locations that we're looking for. And so that's the reason for that. If we wanted to do things like, so let's say that we had like a URL, right? We could use, the sort of title, URL type format of the markdown, right? That we could do that. And because PVA is going to understand basic markdown, and you can even see when we were in the UI earlier, we had the ability to do things like bold, underline links. That's all happening behind the scenes with Markdown. So whatever we want to pass back, we can put in Markdown format. Okay, so now we're just going through basically all of those different responses, and we're just going to add basically the title, just the list. And so now, and then after that, we're going to send that back. So let's go ahead and click that and click save. Okay, so now if we go back here, we say call an action, and then we're able to just select this. Now, the thing you're going to see here is it wants to know, so it's expecting the city value because we told it we were going to give it one. And so now we can go ahead and go to our variables and say city, and then it's going to output a response, which is fine. We can just take that as is. We can just go ahead and say, we could say here are options for the city, and then put a few spaces and then just say the response. Okay, and if we go back here again, what should I eat for lunch in Indianapolis? Okay, And so we had a little bit of a problem here with the spacing on this. And so if we actually go back into the flow, so we got all the content, but it's actually important to get a return there because that is what's going to allow it to know that it's the next one there. So if we add that return, okay, then let's go back. It's a little bit slow. This is several things here with the way the Power Automate loaded in this that is just not, it's very snappy. I've not honestly seen that before, but let's try it again. Okay, so you can see we fixed that issue. So here options are Indianapolis, St. Elmo's, and here in Izzy. So if you're ever in Indianapolis too, I do highly recommend these world famous shrimp cocktail, and actually you can get it at both places. So put that in there. So again, you can sort of see we've interacted with SharePoint, and that is something that is going to be very common. Now, one other sort of kind of extra credit thing that I'll show you is, let's say that we had someone typing a question that we had never anticipated for our any of our topics, right? Like it's not going to match anything. Like, so I could say like, when is the talent show, right? I mean, this is a brand new buy. It has no idea what the talent show is, right? It's saying I can't find a related topic. Wouldn't it be great if we could tap into what happens when that happens and do something? And we can. So there's actual dual settings here, which is interesting. So not this settings, but this settings. If we go down here, there's something called the fallback topic. This is what gets triggered and what was being triggered there every time it can't find an option. And so I can go ahead and enable that, and I can go to the fallback topic. And by default, it's basically going to say, hey, I didn't know what happened here. Let me get you more help with this, and then redirect. But we could say we could get rid of all of that if we wanted to, and we'll just put a message here. Now, what you really could do here, right, is maybe potentially maybe this is where you log, you send an email or you log something to SharePoint saying, hey, somebody had a question and we didn't know what to do with it. So if we do that, save, so it sounds like you're lost. So when it is the talent show, sounds like you're lost. Okay, so you see how that works. So that's an important one. And again, it's sort of interesting that it's kind of buried down there. And the fallback topic is something you'll see in PVA2 as well, but it's actually going to be there by default as a system topic. So, okay. Now jumping back over, that is actually it for me.